And as you say, if it was any other condition, of course, a ramp would be put in, whatever, it would be done, because they would understand that they can't work effectively without it. So that's when you realise how long we have to go to get things, just a level playing field.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. Whether you're right at the beginning, asking what now, or you've trodden this path for a while and are wondering what's next, All Aboard is here for you. We'll bring you key information from expert interviews alongside parents sharing their real-life lived experience to help you feel less alone. I'm Claire, and today we'll be talking to parent guest Georgina Fuller. Georgina is a freelance journalist, speaker, guest lecturer and mother of 3. She writes regularly for the Telegraph, Daily Mail and the iPaper, and has written for everyone from Take a Break to Tatler. She specialises in writing about lifestyle, women and work, and has appeared on the BBC, Channel 4 and ITV, as well as BBC Radio 4 and Radio 2. Georgina lives on the edge of the Cotswolds with her 3 children, 2 of whom are neurodiverse. Her middle child has ADHD and autism, and her eldest was diagnosed with ADHD last year. Georgina herself is self-diagnosed with ADHD because of recognising the patterns in 2 out of her 3 children, as well as the genetic links to the traits of her late mother and biological father. Welcome aboard, Georgina.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here with us today on our parenting episode. So can you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and your children with ADHD?
So I have 3 children, and my eldest just turned 15, my middle one is almost 12, and my youngest is nearly 10. And my middle one was diagnosed with autism in 2000, and when he was 7, I think. So whenever that was, he's 5 years ago. And they also said that he has strong ADHD traits and sensory processing disorder. And as any parent that has gone through this process will know, you get presented with a list of acronyms that you have to work out what they mean and what that means for your child. And then my eldest, which, as I said, I haven't written about, was diagnosed with ADHD last year at 14. And they had said since he was about 6, I think, since he was in about year 1, about ADHD. And I hadn't gone down that route with him, glory of hindsight and all of that. But my youngest one by then was really displaying more significant needs and took up a lot more time and worry. And my eldest was kind of managing quite well, if a little bit borderline disruptive, but very bright and very able. So yeah, we didn't get him diagnosed until years later. And that has mainly been through being at quite a strict grammar school that are very hot on organisation skills, independence and planning. And if he forgets his tie, for example, he'll get a detention, or if he forgets a book, he gets told off. And they're it's a great school, but their style of punishment, for want of a better word, I think is quite archaic. It's kind of 1950s, make them stay in, do detentions. And I said he'd be much better having a movement break or being forced to run around the fields 10 times. That would be much more effective. But they won't budge on that. And they said again about the ADHD, which they brought up in year 7. And I said, right, we've got to get this sorted. So we had a private diagnosis, which obviously so many families can't afford to do. It was a big stretch for us to do it. But in terms of his potential, we were really at a stage where we were thinking he was going to be, we weren't at exclusion stage, but we weren't far off that, to be honest. So it was a buffer really for us, but it was also a way to help him understand that he wasn't a bad person and child. And I remembered going through the process with him and going through the process with my youngest boy. So many parallels, like so many parents, where you look at their behaviour, you look at their reports, you look at their traits, and you see yourself. And you don't really have a point of comparison until you look at it subjectively and think, oh, well, that sounds like me. So I looked back at all my school reports and they were very similar to my eldest son, doing the bare minimum, consistently inconsistent, very easily distracted, has to sit at the front of the class because otherwise I'll just talk to people and forget what I'm supposed to be doing. So lots of the things that I thought were quirks or or problems in myself, 2 out of 3 of my children have inherited. And we're hopefully at a much more understanding and compassionate stage than we were when I was at school in the 80s and 90s. And because I was a girl, I was obviously socially conditioned to be a bit more compliant and people please. So I think I kind of just about got away with it. But yeah, now I self-identify as ADHD. I haven't had an official diagnosis because all my money has gone on getting my kids diagnosed instead. But yeah, I've been on retreats and workshops and presentations and read books. And I definitely sort of see my strengths as being working to a tight deadline, hyper-focus, being able to manage lots of different things at once. When I got your email about this and you said, can you close everything down on your laptop to do this? I was like, oh gosh, there's like 15 different things on my laptop. But there always is at any one stage, and I'm always flitting, and I always listen to music when I'm working, and I move around a lot. And if I do long interviews, I kind of have to have a breather because my brain's like buzzing and I can't sort of process. So I've made adaptations, I suppose, to function really, and to function at full capacity. But yeah, in my experience in sort of mainstream education system, it's very hit and miss as to whether you'll get the same reasonable adjustments, as we call it, for our children to enable them to work effectively and function and be themselves. So yeah, and my youngest so far seems to be okay, like I say okay, it hasn't had a diagnosis or anything. She's very conscientious and very she's not self-sufficient, but right now she's my least worrying child. I'm very grateful to have her. That could all change, but right now we're in a good place with her. And the other two, now they've got their diagnosis.
It's a familiar story, isn't it? And you said at the beginning, you had your son who had his autism diagnosis with ADHD traits, and that obviously, understandably, takes up so much of your time and focus. It's really difficult as a parent when you've got more than one child with additional needs to be across everything at the same time. And then having your older son who's had his diagnosis much later and who sounds like he's gone through his fair share of challenges in relation to school, which again, I'm sure for everybody listening is a very, very common story. So what were those early signs and behaviours that made you suspect that your son had ADHD? Was it your experiences through your younger son with school, or kind of what made you go, beyond obviously the comparisons with yourself?
I think, for so many parents who go through this, I think it's already there. So all the signs, everything was already there, and you were either not in a position or you weren't aware enough to notice them. So my youngest son, like me, was always very hyperactive. The textbook really, very lively, boisterous toddler. He was like, he used to joke he was on a death wish. I was just constantly running around after him, thinking he's going to run out in front of a car, or he had no sort of sense of, no sort of self-preservation skills really when he was very little. But he was very bright and really good at puzzles and very good at language and very articulate. So, there were signs that he was a little bit more extra than most children, but nothing too concerning. And then when he started school, I think boys, again, only speaking from my own experience, but can struggle a lot more. So the whole kind of idea that we have that a 4-year-old should sit still from 9 till 3 p.m. with, yes, free play, great. But, generally they're expected to sit and hold a pencil, and that everything took longer. So he struggled a bit more with that. And then there was the impulsivity and shouting out and blurting out and doing silly things that would let him down, because he's such a lovely natured boy and he's very kind. But he would just be pushing the boundaries, or blurt something out, or answer back to a teacher, that sort of thing. But I think at the time I had Eddie, who was, how old would he have been when Charlie started school? 3, and then, 2. No, I can't even think properly. But yeah, I basically had 2 younger children, which were taking up a lot of time, and I was working, and I didn't really follow it up as much as I should. So until it got to I don't want to say crisis point, but until it got to quite a critical point later on, when I thought we can't not do this anymore because we're actually really doing him a disservice. And all it means now that he's got the diagnosis is that he does have movement breaks. He has extra time for exams if he wants them. He doesn't, because like me, he just rushes through everything at a million miles an hour. But he could if he wanted. And, you know, I think the self-esteem thing is so critical. So I could see that his self-esteem was being affected. And I remember having the same feelings myself, like, why do I do these silly, reckless, impulsive things? Why do I, you know, just doing something silly at school? I remember cutting someone's hair for some reason, probably because I was looking for a dopamine hit or something, the girl sitting in front of me, just things like that. And so you get labelled as a naughty child, and then you absorb it and you think, I am naughty, I am difficult. And then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I could see that that was going to happen with him, and he's got so much potential. And the school has said, he's a natural leader and he can use it to his advantage or to his detriment. And I thought, you know, we really need to shape this in a positive way, and talk about it openly in a positive way. So then when you hear all these, you know, and obviously I'm a journalist, I read the news every day. When you read and hear sort of negative stories about people saying, oh, there's too much diagnosis and what is this? It's so, it hurts, you know, and it really, and I have had those prejudices myself. So I wouldn't have believed, I did think ADHD was disruptive boys on, I don't know, too many E-numbers and lazy parents, you know. I mean, we've all had those prejudices. We've all had those, not we've all, but I think lots of people of my generation, I know they have, because people have asked me and I know what they're thinking. They're thinking, oh, she's just got a label because that's convenient, and that means he'll get extra time. I know it's because he can't regulate himself, or, you know, because she can't manage him. So yeah, I think having these sorts of conversations and sharing experiences like you're doing on this podcast is so important, because if it just changes a few people's minds and then they have more conversations with people, then it's just part of a ripple effect of being more understanding, more aware and more compassionate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, because as you say, these headlines appear every day and they're often less than helpful. And it seems that stigma perpetuates very much with ADHD. It's the one area that we almost don't want increase in diagnoses in, even though it's directly as a result of these conversations and generally raising awareness, so that people who are genuinely struggling, who are having exceptionally difficult times, suddenly start to have almost a lens with which to understand what's going on in their family. And if that was applied to any other physical medical ailment, we would see this in a completely different way. But somehow with ADHD, and particularly the self-diagnosis element, and I would argue that to a degree with any of us, when we've ever first gone to a doctor about anything, we're all self-diagnosed to a degree, you know, and we know, you talked about your son's self-esteem, but there are very, very, very real risks to young people with either late diagnosis or ADHD going undiagnosed. You know, risks that worst case end in prison pathway, or even worse than that, with, you know, suicide and just such tragic things. So these things are so vitally important, because we need to shape them positively. That's the difference between a very positive life outcome and not. And for those who are listening, who are not as privileged as perhaps we've both been to be able to pursue the private diagnosis, that waiting game, those years that pass in their child's life are so crucial, which is why I think these conversations are so important to help everybody.
And I think I've written so much more about my middle one's autism, because that seems to be perfectly honest, more socially acceptable. And because he seems to be more, and again, the language and terminology is so difficult. I mean, I don't describe it as a disability, and I don't say disorder, but I know that obviously if he was non-verbal or if he was severely impaired, I would see it like that. So there's so many different variations on the spectrum, but ADHD I think is somehow still less socially acceptable than autism. And I think we all have an idea of what an autistic person is like, and we have and you know, as you say, with the path of ADHD, when you look at so many people and you meet so many people, especially in creative industries, and you think ADHD and Asperger's. I mean, unfortunately, it's not even an extreme. It's not even a kind of scaremongering thing to say. You can map out someone's life from having early ADHD. And I read DJ Fat Tony's book recently, and he is just classic ADHD. Like, it's so extreme, and all of his dopamine hunting and his drug taking and his promiscuity and everything was, obviously his neuro whatever the terminology is, in his mind was firing on all cylinders, and all of the messages that he'd had at school and his dysfunctional, difficult childhood. And you just think, well, of course, I mean, it's a miracle he's still alive, really. So yeah, the risks of not getting diagnosis, I think, which, there's so many barriers to it, and it's such a long process. And as you say, the years waiting, and the questions. And, I think as a parent, I cut myself off from so many friends and people that I know and school, because I felt so judged by my children. And I felt it's just the most personal thing, isn't it? That, if there's something wrong with your child, then there's something wrong with you. And we all have, I think, a dream or a aspiration to have a very, I certainly did, a healthy, normal, loving family. And then when that doesn't happen, it's really upsetting, and you really have to kind of unpick your own feelings and prejudices and hang-ups, I suppose. So I think for every parent of every child, we go through, I hate the word journey, it's very overused, but we go through such a long journey. And by the time you actually get a diagnosis, it's already, it doesn't just happen, does it? It takes years. So many boxes have already been ticked, and so many issues have already been explored. And the self-diagnosis. I mean, I've written a piece which hasn't yet run, where I interviewed a few so-called experts on this, and they said the self-diagnosis, even that term, is slightly derogatory. It implies that someone is making themselves, appointing themselves as an expert of something. But you kind of have to, because there's such a lack of awareness, support, studies, research. Signposting is just non-existent. So I think people have to self-diagnose in a way, and have to take matters into their own hands, because if it's really extreme, then the consequences are awful. At the worst case scenario.
Yeah, you're so right. And I know you said you don't like the word journey. I quite like it, but only because there's no getting away from it. I'm sort of owning it in the sense that it is a journey, because whether you come to this through self-diagnosis, you're awaiting diagnosis, you've had diagnosis, we're all somewhere on that path. And as you rightly said, that brings with it a whole host of emotions and things that we have to process within ourselves. And I think that starts with grief to some degree, because, we all have these ideals that we think we're going to, family life that we're going to have. And then suddenly we have to really adjust and adapt to what our children actually need versus the kind of shoulds. So how did you feel when your son had that ADHD diagnosis? Did that change how you felt?
No, I mean, I just felt relieved. And I mean, it really has made me very conscious of my own issues with self-regulating, and, especially as a parent. And I had 3 in 5 years, and there was lots of shouting during that time. And, I look back and think, well, that's how my mother was. And, there was lots of love and lots of laughter and wonderful times too. But, you kind of look back and think, oh, okay, how have I managed this? How have I navigated it? Or how has that exacerbated it? So you go through all of that. But I think by the time he was diagnosed, I mean, I've already been through that anyway, with my middle one. But I think I haven't sort of talked about it with Charlie because, well, A, he's older. So there's the sort of privacy thing. But also, if I'm perfectly honest, I don't want people to think, oh, so she's got another one now that's, diagnosed, because then it's like, as I say, it's nowhere near as pronounced, or his needs, for want of a better word, are not anywhere near as pronounced as his brother. So his brother is always going to be the sort of primary one in terms of, we have to do, as you said about any other condition, reasonable adjustments and risk assessments, as it were, and pre-warn and preempt, and I'm totally fine with that. And I don't have to do that with Charlie, so he's very high functioning, for want of a better term. So yeah, I mean, it's a relief, but also just confirms everything that we already knew. And unfortunately, in order to get support, especially at a state school, that's what you've got to do. Unfortunately, like, he's not going to get any extra help unless he has that. And we weren't going to go down the medication route, but I have heard, some very positive reports about that as well. So again, I thought, oh, well, I'd never do that. And then I think, oh, well, actually, when people describe it as suddenly being able to concentrate for the first time, as suddenly being able to drown out all the additional noise, and I think about how hard it is for me to concentrate, I think, well, yeah, never say never. I'm not ruling that out. So, again, with a diagnosis, that's an option, and it wouldn't have been an option before, if we choose that. And also, it means, I guess, I'll have the diagnosis for the rest of his life. So that's something that he can say to people. And, I do think about, oh God, when he goes out drinking, and what if he gets into a fight, or what if he does something stupid? Again, at least he will have that. Because again, when I think about some of the positions that I put myself in, I think he has that slightly reckless tendency. But at least he will know that there's a reason that he's neurologically wired to have a little, I don't know, gap in a place where some people might be a bit more rational. He has a slightly different way of doing things, and hopefully that will be something he can manage and carry his whole life.
And hopefully all the work that we're all doing, the podcast, all your articles go some way to helping move this conversation forward positively, so that there is more acceptance and more awareness by the time they get to that stage. Because I think it is a process, even as a parent, as you are, who is already got one child with additional needs, and you are well used to many of these things, suddenly being in the ADHD world and considering the different pathways, I guess, to the best way to manage this for your son, like medication, as you mentioned. Even that presents elements where you're having to challenge your own preconceptions and ideas. Absolutely. And suddenly open your mind. I was very much the same. My son does take medication. It's a very personal thing. He takes a methylphenidate, and has done since he was actually really young. But to him, the difference is absolutely night and day. And I talk about it being something that fundamentally helps to level the playing field for him as much as is possible in the classroom. But on its own, it's not a magic wand. It's not a miracle cure. But it is a very positive and necessary part of all the things that we do to support him. And the rest of it is obviously kind of intervention based in a classroom, skills based for him, channeling all that energy, building positive self-esteem. But it does help in the classroom. And you mentioned at the beginning of this, obviously, all the challenges that he was having at school, and their approach to managing the behaviours in the classroom. Has having that ADHD diagnosis made a positive impact for him?
It definitely has. So he has, movement breaks now, which, just it's such a minor thing, but just being able to get up and walk around for 5 minutes makes a huge difference. And also, I think there was one detention last term, and his head of year, who's also got 3 kids, similar ages, called and said, she's a food tech teacher, I know that you said you don't want him sitting in a classroom for an hour after school. What about if I get him to do the washing up in the food lab? And I said, brilliant, great.
Amazing.
So he came back and he was all pleased with himself because he'd done loads of, washed stuff and put it away. And also, now, I don't know how old your son is. I'm really struggling with the teenage. He's very, I'll say, rebellious. I mean, he's challenging, should we say. So trying to get him to go to bed on time because his school is miles away, because we're in just on the edge of the catchment area. So he has to leave the house just after 7. So I have to get him out of bed at 6:30, trying to get him to go to bed at 10:15, and then kind of have some, proper sleep time. That's a problem. And then his diet is terrible. He just wants to eat rubbish food. He's had an ingrowing toenail, which means that he's not doing as much football. So his sport has, really taken a nosedive. So all of those things are much harder, but I know why they are harder now. So it's made me a more compassionate and understanding parent, but also just to flag up with the school that, it's not a willful, he's not being deliberately disobedient. And homework, now we're getting into that. Oh, can you do a revision plan? He's like, I've got Easter. What? I'm not working over Easter. We're going away to Devon and we're going to have fun. And he's. And then I went to a talk and we're supposed to be doing a colour-coded revision timetable. There's just no way. There's just no way. But at least I can say, look, he's going to struggle with that. And my daughter would love that kind of thing. So. I am, again, really conscious. I've got 3 very different children, and they all have different needs. And, yes, 2 have diagnosed with additional needs, but, every child is different. But parenting him is hard, it's definitely harder. So, yeah, I think it's just making the school more aware and having more conversations. And they are so limited into that whole, this is what you've got to do. It's, as I said, a very academic school. They're very results driven. He will do the bare minimum and he's very lazy. So yeah, I'm hoping that coming up to year 10, 11, they are going to be a bit more lenient and a bit more understanding of his ways, and that he's not necessarily going to be doing 6 weeks revision in advance, because that's just not going to work for him.
Yeah, it's not possible. I think there's a challenge there, isn't there? And again, this is something that I hear a lot, where the schools accept a diagnosis, but it's almost like, but we know you've got ADHD, but if you could also not, because you need to do this. And you're like, well, that's idealistic, isn't it? It's not going to happen that way. So actually, this is what can happen, or this is the adaptations that we need to make, and be realistic about this, because we have to stop punishing children for symptoms of their neurodiversity, for the brains that they've got, and kind of work with them so that they can succeed and that they can come out of school with their self-esteem intact and kind of feeling good about themselves for all the amazing positive traits that they have.
Absolutely. And actually, just thinking about it, we had parents' evening on Thursday, I think last week. We had 3 minutes with the SEN person, 3 minutes. And so I've got a call with his head of year tomorrow to just talk about, are there going to be any adjustments going forward? Because it is going to be difficult for him to do revision. It is going to be difficult for him to, maintain concentration in the same way as his neurotypical peers. So we are going to have a chat. And I feel in a way as if I've exhausted so much time and energy and research into fighting to get his brother into a specialist school and going through HCPs and educational psychologists and making sure that everything is ticked. And his school are brilliant. They've got occupational health team, and they've got speech and language people and all of that. But obviously Charlie's school, because it's a mainstream school, they don't have any of that. So I really need to, look at what he's going to need and sit down and think about that and be very vocal and ask what they're going to do to put that in place. But I'm expecting he will be like me and just wing it with the bare minimum, probably. And and we just sorted out work experience as well, which that's going to be interesting. But yeah, it's a different set of challenges, definitely. And the education system, unfortunately, we've got to be ambassadors and whatever, warriors for our children, haven't we? Because we can't rely on that being done. And as you say, if it was any other condition, of course, a ramp would be put in, whatever, it would be done, because they would understand that they can't work effectively without it. So that's when you realise how long we have to go to get things, just a level playing field.
Yeah, ramps is exactly the right way to describe it. It's a word I use. So obviously we talked a lot about the kind of challenges but what about something positive? Like, can you share a success story or unique strength that your son has, something that you're really proud of?
Oh, I mean, his get up and go and his drive and his energy is admirable, and he's great fun, and he is a natural leader. Again, I was thinking about Eddie and his Lego ability, and his, people have a preconception with autism. I know this is ADHD, but about the empathy thing. And I just want to kind of really refute that, because Charlie, I remember, took some money from my wallet without asking a few years ago, and I'd said he could have a £5 or something, and he'd taken a tenner. And anyway, I found it and was shouting at him. And Eddie, his brother, came down and emptied out his piggy bank on the kitchen table and said, "Here you go, you take what I have." And then Charlie felt really awful, and basically was trying to sell a load of stuff online to give me the money back that he'd taken. So no, I mean, he's got a very strong moral compass. And I mean, both of the boys, because we live in a small village, we don't go into, we go to London quite a bit. I don't with my middle one, but I do with Charlie. And, if we see people sleeping on the streets, homeless people, they will always say, "We've got to give them some money, go and get them a sandwich, go and make them a cup of tea," which, if you're walking around Oxford or Birmingham or Oxford Street, I mean, it's just ridiculous. You can't stop every time. But I think, they're compassionate, thoughtful people, and that makes me proud. Yes, kind, and Charlie will always be the one that goes. And there was a boy that no one had invited to any parties in year 7, and Charlie said, "Oh, well, we've got to invite him over and invite him to our party, to my party." So they're good at that kind of thing. They're thoughtful.
Oh, they sound incredibly thoughtful, incredibly kind. So what one piece of advice would you like to leave parents listening to help them feel less alone on this journey?
I would say find your tribe. It's such a cliche, but I mean, meet people online, join groups, join support groups, look at your local Facebook, see what there is for parents of SEND in the area, and try and meet up with other people that are going through similar problems, or just message them, or try and have a WhatsApp group or something, so that you're not totally beating your head up against a wall. Because I think if you are in a small community and you do have a disruptive child, you can really start to feel like a pariah, and that really affects you, and then it affects your parenting and your confidence. So I would say just find as many people as you can, as possible, to talk to and to share it with. And you've got to share, and sometimes it's easier to share with people you don't know than it is with people that you do, because you don't have any sort of preconceptions or judgment. And it's very isolating. It's really hard, really isolating. And I think people would look at me and think, "Oh, she's got this great job and she's always off doing things." And, I try not to just do edited highlights on Instagram, which I made my Instagram private because I was worried about people from school looking at photos mostly. But, it's really hard being a parent of a neurodiverse child. It's the hardest thing. So find people that get it, and that understand you.
I think that's such good advice. And, hopefully, ultimately, that's the purpose of this podcast, is to try and help build a community if people feel that they don't have that immediately around them. That was certainly the case with me. I couldn't see my son reflected back. And I think your honesty, thank you so much for sharing, will really, really resonate with people to understand, or at least feel like there are other people out there who understand, who have that compassion, who've had all those thoughts and feelings and experiences and still do. It will mean so much to people. So thank you very much for sharing so honestly with us today about your amazing boys and all your incredible work to help keep this conversation going.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about Georgina's experiences parenting neurodiverse children, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. Or if you'd like to find out about how I can help support you and your children with personalised ADHD coaching, then please do head to the website allaboardadhd.com. You can also find me on Instagram at allaboardadhd. Most importantly, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please can you follow and review All Aboard to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard.